Her trembling hand clamped over the worn fabric of her coat, muffling the tiny whimper from within as the polished glass door to the interview room reflected her pale, terrified face. Jessica Davis pressed her palm harder against the thin wool of her coat, trying to smother the sound leaking from the bundle held tight to her chest. The fluorescent lights of the Cormac Industries lobby hummed with an aggressive sterility, each flicker magnifying the sheen of sweat on her forehead. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the chrome and glass silence of the waiting area. A single, desperate thought looped in her mind. They cannot hear her. They cannot know she is here. Footsteps echoed from a distant hallway, and Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the sound to recede. For a few more minutes of fragile invisibility. The chair beneath her was cold, unforgiving leather, offering no comfort, only amplifying her isolation in the cavernous, empty space. She could feel the faint, desperate vibrations of her baby stirring against her own shaking body. She risked a glance at the sleek digital display mounted on the wall. Its glowing letters scrolled silently. Cormac Industries, forging the future. Below it, a mission statement about innovation and integrity blurred before her eyes. Integrity. The word felt like a physical blow, a cruel joke aimed directly at her. She was here under a veil of deceit, hiding her most precious and most disqualifying secret. Harper, her daughter, was only 6 weeks old, a tiny, fragile being whose existence would shatter this opportunity. Just a little longer, sweet girl, she pleaded silently, her gaze dropping to the floor. Please, just stay quiet until I get inside. The air conditioning clicked on, blowing a stream of cold air that did nothing to cool the fire of panic burning in her veins. Before we continue with the story, be sure to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments. We love learning about our viewers. Now let's get back to the story. A shrill ringtone from an office deep within the building made her jump. Harper startled at the sudden noise, her tiny body going rigid against Jessica's chest. A muffled, protesting squawk escaped from beneath her coat. Jessica immediately began to rock. A subtle, desperate motion she hoped looked like simple, nervous fidgeting. She hummed a lullaby under her breath, the notes barely a whisper, lost in the ambient drone of the building. Her eyes darted toward the glass wall of the conference room, where her interview was scheduled to take place. 3 figures were visible as indistinct silhouettes, their heads bowed together in quiet conference. One of them had to be Victoria Grant, the HR manager whose name was on the email. Jessica had memorized the name, the title, the gatekeeper to her future. The main entrance doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and a man in a crisp, dark suit strode in. He walked with purpose, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. He paid her no mind, his attention fixed on his phone as he headed toward a bank of elevators. The faint, expensive scent of his cologne washed over her as he passed, a smell of wealth and success that felt a world away from her own reality of stale formula and desperation. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, and the lobby was silent once more. Jessica let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping in momentary relief. But the reprieve was short-lived. The silence only made the next sound from her baby seem louder. Harper let out a stronger, more insistent cry, muffled but unmistakable. Jessica's hand, slick with sweat, clamped down again. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. No, no, no. Not now. She pressed the diaper bag against her leg, the rough canvas a grounding texture in her spiraling fear. She could feel the baby's frantic movements, the tiny fists beating a panicked rhythm against her sternum. The warmth of her daughter's body was a stark contrast to the icy dread coiling in her stomach. She had to calm her down, but any overt movement would draw attention. She was trapped. A statue of terror in a designer lobby, praying for a miracle that felt increasingly remote. Her entire future depended on the next 10 minutes. She nudged the diaper bag with the toe of her worn shoe, the metallic gleam of the zipper catching the light. Inside, she knew, was the last of her resources: 1 clean diaper, a small handful of wipes, and a bottle containing 2 ounces of cold formula. It was not enough. Nothing felt like it was enough. She had no family to help, no partner to lean on. The babysitter had cancelled at the last minute, an unapologetic text message that had sent Jessica's carefully constructed plans into a tailspin. This interview was her only chance, the only lifeline she could grasp. The position as an administrative assistant was not a dream job, but it was a steady paycheck, a way to build a life for Harper, a life that did not involve constant, gnawing fear about rent and food. Through the smoked glass wall, she saw one of the silhouettes move. A woman with a severe, angular haircut stood up. Victoria Grant. Jessica's heart leaped into her throat. The woman's posture was rigid, authoritative. She gestured toward the door, her movements sharp and decisive. The other two figures remained seated, their faces turned toward the door as well. Jessica knew they were talking about her, the next candidate on their list, Jessica Davis. 24. Eager, qualified, deceitful. The self-recrimination was a bitter taste in her mouth. She straightened her back, trying to project a confidence she did not feel, a pathetic attempt to mimic the corporate poise of her surroundings. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her black slacks. Victoria Grant's gaze swept across the lobby, a brief, impersonal scan. For a terrifying second, her eyes seemed to lock onto Jessica's. Jessica froze, her entire body tensing. She fixed her gaze on a potted plant in the corner, feigning calm, trying to appear as just another applicant waiting her turn. Did she see? Could she tell? The woman's expression was unreadable from this distance, a mask of professional detachment. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Victoria turned back to her colleagues, her attention once again consumed by the meeting inside. Jessica's shoulders sagged, the tension draining out of her in a rush, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. She was still safe, the secret was still hers. The low murmur of voices from behind the glass suddenly ceased. A heavy, profound silence fell over the lobby, broken only by the incessant hum of the lights. Then came the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, a loud, jarring noise in the stillness. Jessica's head snapped up. Footsteps, clear and deliberate, were approaching the conference room door from the inside. They were coming for her. Her moment had arrived. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose her features into a pleasant, professional smile, a mask to hide the raw panic underneath. It's time. Be strong. You can do this. The lie was thin, but it was all she had. Her resolve shattered in an instant. Perhaps sensing the finality of the moment, the sudden surge of adrenaline in its mother, the baby let out a sharp, piercing sound. It was not a cry, but a choked, startled gasp for air, a sound of distress too loud and too distinct for the thin coat to conceal. It was the sound of discovery, the sound of failure. It was the sound of a dream, dying in a sterile, indifferent lobby. Her baby's gasp echoed through the laminate corridor as the interview door clicked ajar. The click of the latch was a gunshot in the silent room. The heavy glass door swung inward, revealing Victoria Grant standing in the threshold. She held a sleek black clipboard, and her expression was a careful construction of professional impatience. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, performed a swift, head-to-toe appraisal of Jessica, lingering for a fraction of a second on her worn but clean shoes. The HR manager's perfectly arched eyebrows furrowed slightly, a silent critique of Jessica's appearance. The gasp from inside Jessica's coat had been loud, but perhaps the acoustics of the hallway had swallowed it. A fragile, desperate hope flickered within her. Maybe she had not heard it. Jessica Davis. Victoria's voice was as crisp and starched as her white blouse. It was not a question so much as a summons. Jessica managed a weak nod, her throat suddenly constricting, making speech impossible. She tried to push herself to her feet, to project the image of an eager candidate, but her legs felt like lead, weighed down by dread. The simple act of standing seemed an insurmountable task. Her body refused to cooperate, frozen by the certainty of impending disaster. She clutched her coat tighter, a useless, instinctive gesture of protection for the secret she carried. Victoria's gaze hardened at her hesitation, her impatience becoming more pronounced. Just behind Victoria, emerging from the corridor that led deeper into the corporate offices, a man came into view. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a full head of silver hair combed neatly back from his forehead. His suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, a dark charcoal gray that spoke of quiet, immense expense. He moved with an unhurried, confident grace, an aura of absolute authority preceding him. It was Alistair Finch, the company's CEO. Jessica recognized him from the About Us page on the website. His presence here now was an unforeseen complication, a variable for which she could not have possibly prepared. His path would take him directly past the open conference room door. Harper, agitated by her mother's rigid posture and the strange, muffled environment, squirmed violently. A tiny foot kicked hard against Jessica's ribs, forcing a small grunt of pain from her lips. It was followed by a series of hiccuping sobs, each one a hammer blow against Jessica's composure. The sounds were undeniable now, small but distinct in the quiet lobby. Victoria Grant's head tilted, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone shifting from impatience to sharp-edged confusion. She took a half-step forward, her gaze fixed on Jessica's midsection, where the fabric of her coat was visibly trembling. The fragile hope of a moment ago evaporated, replaced by cold certainty. Jessica shook her head, a jerky, frantic motion that betrayed her panic. "No, I am fine," she managed to whisper, the words feeling like sand in her mouth. "He can't see, please don't let him see." But the CEO was closer now, his polished Oxford shoes making almost no sound on the thick plush carpeting of the executive hallway. He was no longer looking ahead, but had turned his head slightly, his attention drawn by the tableau at the conference room door, the stern HR manager, the terrified young woman who could not stand, and the strange muffled sounds emanating from her. His stride did not falter, but his focus was now entirely on them. Mr. Finch slowed his pace as he drew level with the open door. His eyes, a cool and piercing shade of blue, bypassed Victoria completely and settled on Jessica. He did not need to be a detective to see that something was profoundly wrong. He saw the tremor in her hands, the sheen of sweat on her pale skin, the almost imperceptible rocking motion of her body. He saw the desperate way she clutched her coat, as if it were a shield. He saw her shaking foot, tapping a frantic, uncontrolled rhythm against the polished floor. His expression remained placid, revealing nothing of his thoughts, but the intensity of his gaze made Jessica feel as though her very bones were being X-rayed. He came to a complete stop, just a few feet away, a silent, imposing figure in the doorway. The silence that fell was different now. It was charged, heavy with unspoken questions. Victoria Grant looked from the unblinking gaze of her CEO to the crumbling composure of the job candidate, her professional poise finally cracking under the pressure of the bizarre situation. Confusion warred with annoyance on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to dismiss Jessica and end the awkwardness, but a subtle gesture from Mr. Finch, a slight raise of his hand, stopped her before a word could be formed. He continued to watch Jessica, his silence a powerful tool that stripped away her last defenses. Jessica's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She could feel the warm, damp patch on her shirt where Harper's face was pressed, the frantic, tiny heartbeat a mirror of her own. She was trapped in a spotlight of scrutiny, pinned between the HR manager's cold judgment and the CEO's unnerving calm. Her mind went blank. All the prepared answers, all the practiced lines about her skills and ambitions, dissolved into a meaningless jumble. There was only the here and now, the hum of the lights, the smell of antiseptic, the weight of her baby, and the two pairs of eyes dissecting her. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and shameful. "Miss Grant," the CEO finally said, his voice quiet but resonant with an authority that commanded instant obedience. "Let us give the candidate a moment." His eyes never left Jessica's face, but the words were a clear dismissal of his employee. Victoria stiffened, clearly unaccustomed to being sidelined, but she gave a curt nod and stepped back, retreating slightly into the conference room. Mr. Finch held his position, his presence filling the space, creating a strange, protected bubble around Jessica. For the first time, she felt that his gaze was not one of judgment, but of something else, something she could not quite name. He took one deliberate step closer, closing the distance between them. The movement was slow, measured, designed not to startle. His focus, however, had shifted. It was no longer on her face, but lower, on the unnatural bulge beneath her coat. He saw the fabric twitch, saw it rise and fall with a rhythm that was not her own breathing. It was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. The puzzle was complete. The CEO's gaze flicked from her face to the bulge beneath her coat. Jessica went absolutely still, her breath locked in her lungs. The CEO's gaze was not accusatory, but it was direct and deeply inquisitive, leaving no room for denial. The silent acknowledgement hung in the air between them. He knows. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, a relief. The strain of maintaining the impossible secret had become a physical burden, and now it was lifted. The silence in the lobby stretched, thick and heavy, as Victoria Grant and the two other interviewers watched from the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Mr. Finch's calm demeanor seemed to absorb all the tension in the room, creating a small island of quiet in the middle of her personal storm. Slowly, with a grace that seemed out of place for a man of his corporate stature, he crouched down. He did not kneel but lowered himself into a stable, athletic squat, bringing his eyes level with hers. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to the sterile power dynamics of the environment, that it momentarily stunned her. "It is all right," he said, and his voice was startlingly gentle, stripped of all corporate hardness. It was the voice of a person, not a CEO. It was a simple statement of reassurance, offered without condition or judgment, and it was the one thing that could finally break through her wall of fear. He made no move toward her, did not reach for her coat, or ask what she was hiding. He simply waited, his calm, patient gaze giving her the space to make the next move. His quiet decency was more disarming than any accusation would have been. A choked sob escaped Jessica's lips, and the single tear that had traced a path down her cheek was followed by another. Her defenses crumbled completely. With fingers that trembled uncontrollably, she reached for the zipper of her coat. The metallic rasp as she pulled it down was the only sound in the room. She peeled the fabric back, revealing the source of the commotion. There, nestled against her chest, was the tiny, flushed face of baby Harper. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her rosebud mouth was open in a silent, exhausted cry, and her wispy brown hair was damp with sweat. She was perfect and small and overwhelmingly present. The CEO's expression, which had been one of calm neutrality, softened instantly. The mask of the powerful executive dissolved, replaced by a look of profound, unguarded compassion. He did not see a liability or a problem. He saw a mother and her child. For a moment, he just looked at Harper, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. A sharp, audible gasp came from the conference room doorway. Victoria Grant had stepped forward, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of utter disbelief. The two men behind her stared, their jaws slack with astonishment. Their stern, professional facades had been shattered, and in their place was a raw, unfiltered mix of shock and clear disapproval. One of the men muttered something to the other, a low, critical sound that cut through the quiet moment. They saw an unprofessional, irresponsible girl who had brought a baby to a job interview. They saw a problem to be managed. The CEO, however, saw something entirely different. "Stand up," Mr. Finch said, his voice once again firm, but the command was not directed at Jessica. He was looking straight at Victoria Grant and her two colleagues. His gentle demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, commanding authority that left no room for argument. "The interview is postponed." He turned his attention back to Jessica, his expression softening again. He rose to his full height and said, "Come with me." The words were an invitation, not an order. He was offering her a way out of the spotlight, a retreat from the judgmental eyes of the interview panel. He offered Jessica his hand, not to pull her up, but as a steadying gesture of support should she need it. Gathering the last of her strength, Jessica pushed herself to her feet, one arm securely cradling Harper, the other steadying herself on the armrest of the chair. As she stood, Harper, perhaps sensing the shift in her mother's emotions from terror to a fragile sense of safety, finally quieted. Her small, hitching sobs subsided into soft, sleepy breaths. Jessica pulled her coat closed, not to hide her daughter, but to shield her from the cold air and the cold stares. Mr. Finch turned and began walking down the corridor, his confident stride creating a protective wake for Jessica to follow. He led her past the stunned and silent interview panel, his back straight, his presence a clear and unspoken rebuke to their reaction. He did not glance at them. They had been dismissed, rendered irrelevant. He stopped at a solid wood door halfway down the hall and opened it, revealing a spacious, quiet office. A large mahogany desk sat before a window with a view of the city. "Sit here," he said, gesturing toward a plush leather armchair in the corner. The room was a sanctuary. He started to close the door, but paused, looking back at Victoria Grant, who had followed them at a distance, her face a confused mix of indignation and dawning shame. His voice, when he spoke to her, was low and intense, meant only for her and her colleagues. "You saw a young woman in clear distress, and your first reaction was impatience and judgment. You are in human resources. I suggest you re-evaluate what the human part of that title requires." The color drained from Victoria's face, and the two men behind her shifted their weight, unable to meet his gaze. They stood chastened in the hallway as he closed the door. Mr. Finch left Jessica and Harper in the peaceful quiet of his office. He crossed to the large desk and picked up the receiver of his phone, his back to her. "Security? This is Alistair Finch," he said, his voice calm and efficient. "Please go to the cafe on the ground floor and bring a bottle of warm milk to my office. Immediately, and tell my 10 o'clock I will be 15 minutes late." He hung up and turned back to Jessica, his expression once again gentle. Jessica looked down at her daughter, who was now sleeping soundly in her arms, and a wave of impossible, overwhelming relief washed over her. She gently rocked her baby. Safe at last in the quiet room,